Okay, so welcome everybody. I am tickled to be here. I'd like to make sure everybody's on the right flight. If you're on this plane, we're assuming that you would like to see if you can up your game when it comes to communicating cyber strategy to the C-suite and or the board and or the owners of your company or business decision makers. So this slide tells you all the alphabet soup that says why I'm in the Discord in the first place. But more specifically, why I'm giving this session is that I have been working with Fortune 100, 500 C-suite since the last millennium. I was at that point in time running mission critical technology projects. I hadn't gotten into cybersecurity. I've been in cybersecurity a little over 10 years now, 11. But so I was running mission critical technology projects. And what was happening was that the biggest breakdowns came when the technology was forcing the business to change how it does things. And nobody had their eye on that ball of working with the business about the changes it was going to have to make. I decided to get a skill set to both avoid some of those kinds of problems and mitigate those problems when they did occur. And what came of that was it just became really clear that we can't just do bottom-up technology projects. We also have to get top-down support. So that inevitably led to my starting to work with C-suite owners, senior leaders. And they go by different names depending on, how the organization is structured. So there is no communication without a listener. And I propose, therefore, that we start this conversation by talking about how do we meet our audience where they are. If you've ever been part of a scene where an adult walks into a room full of teenagers and says something like, "Would somebody please take out the trash?" You know what it's like you can be speaking, but ain't nobody listening. So one of the first things I'd like to address and give you some of my sort of what I've learned the hard way is, how to meet our listener where they are so they're actually listening to us. Then I propose we're going to talk about some examples of what things look like when I do this work. And I'm hoping that even as we're talking through the examples piece, we'll get some of your input and questions and, gee, I'd like to see this, or what about that? I'd really, because what I have is a lot more slides than I intend to show you, but which ones we pick, you have a lot of say in that. And the quote in the top right is really why we do this, because at the end of the day, what we do in the security organization is only a fraction of what's really needed to get the job done, right? It's just like with CMMC and 800-171 compliance, we so often say that the technology is only, the technical controls are only part of the equation. The people in the process is a big chunk of that. And so that involves getting buy-in from the top down as well as the bottom-up frontline team members. Okay, so meeting our audience where they are. This starting slide, especially for, I will read this for anybody who's just on the phone and isn't able to see the slide. This is from a series that started a really long time ago on Facebook called Humans of New York. And what they do is they ask permission, and they're usually wandering around Manhattan, and they ask permission to take a picture of one or more people, and then they ask them a pithy question. So in this case, the pictures of two middle-aged men that are sitting on a park bench on a beautiful day. And it starts like this, who are you? And they say, we're eye doctors. So what's something about the eye that most people don't realize? And they reply, these are eye doctors. The eye doesn't see, the brain sees. The eye just transmits. So what we see isn't only determined by what comes through the eyes. What we see is affected by our memories, our feelings, and by what we've seen before. So I offer this up to set the context and set the tone that the C-suite is not a monolith, and even as a collective, if we're talking about a leadership committee, an executive committee, sometimes it's called the senior leadership team. They usually have a catchy name for themselves, but these are a collection of individuals who are all coming to that function with very different perspectives. And so sometimes if we're addressing all of them at once, like in a quarterly brief or something like that, we can speak to their collective common ground and goals. But when we're meeting with them as individuals, it's tremendously more powerful when we can focus on the way they see the world and what their concerns are. So how do we do that? And I've come to realize after decades of doing this work that there are really 3 dimensions to communicating strategy. Now, this is how we communicate strategy, not how we evolve the strategy itself. This assumes that we already know what it is we want to have a conversation with them about. But so how do we do that? So the first thing is deciding who we want to talk to. And sometimes we're summoned to give a brief on a quarterly basis, but frequently when we want to start an initiative, we want to put, better insider threat controls in place or whatever it is we think it's time to do on behalf of the business goals. We need to decide who we want to speak with and how to justify that meeting and then how to prepare for that meeting. So that's the first part of this. The next part is, what is it that we have to share with them? What's going to be compelling to them? What's in it for them? Who do they give authority to? Who are they going to listen? Because, even as an outside consultant, they're not going to listen to what Linda says just because Linda said it. So I come in with sources, and you'll see in the samples that I'll show you the way that I work with citations and statistics and benchmarking. They'll often give a lot more credibility to others that are in their role at other organizations, to, big 4 consulting firms, to research numbers and statistics. So, how to find that material and use it to build the story that you want to tell and put their attention on. And then last but not least is, how do we structure this conversation in a way that flows so that we move them in the direction of action that we're asking them for? So in that diagram I just showed you, each of the symbols, each of the graphics actually has some meaning to it. Now, this is really the core of what I want to share with you today. But today, what we're here to do is just have an overview and a brief conversation, and to really cover this material in any depth is a lot more time than that. The WHO symbol at the top, the concentric blue circles, is really an impact diagram. All the PMPs who are here will probably recognize it as such. You might think of it as a bullseye. You might think of it as if you dropped a drop of water in a still pool, the rings that ripple out from that drop of water. So it's a technique that they teach project managers, program managers, about how to identify who your stakeholders are and their relative importance and influence to you accomplishing your objective. We're going to talk a little bit about today, just as an introductory basis, once you've done that kind of an analysis, how do you tailor your remarks to fit different audiences or a common audience? Like I said, if you're talking to the whole senior leadership team, how do you do that differently than if you're just meeting with the CFO? And again, we're just going to do that at an intro level. When the next item is down graphically is a chart, and that's just a sample of, so that's what our slides look like. And like I said, we'll go through a bunch of different slides. So today we'll give a sample of different ways, and we'll also talk about the categories that I think about when I'm thinking about, okay, what are the things I want to make sure make it into my sample to this individual or this group that we're going to be meeting with. And then last but not least, the how. What that diagram at the bottom of the slide it represents is a structure for how conversations happen. Specifically, there are different conversation types, but that particular symbol represents how, if you're wanting to create a conversation that moves to action, what are the natural structures that happen in human conversation? If you know about that structure, you can use it like a tool. If you don't know about that structure, the conversation is still going to happen with that structure. It's actually been shown in research. My Discord window. So,
Oh,
back.
I was going to say, are you still with us?
Do you?
Can you share your screen again?
Yeah. It just happened, right?
Yes.
Okay. There. How's that? You see it now?
It's coming up. Yep, you got it.
Okay. Yay. Okay. So these are the three main things to think about in terms of all the cylinders you have to be hitting on in order to be effective in your communication. Who you're talking to, what you're presenting to them that they might find compelling, and then how you structure the conversation. And as we move forward today, what I'm hoping to accomplish is a very high-level, broad brush intro on the who do we want to talk to and how do we speak to them differently. We're going to do a quick sample on what that looks like when we're really doing it. And I'm just going to try to model how a conversation for action happens. I'm not even going to try to get into explaining that structure right now. That's for another day. Okay, so here's a sample agenda. I chose a starting point of the engineering assets owner. It's not at all unusual for me to start top right and put that very same statement about the reason, Mr. VP of Engineering, we're here to talk with you is because a lot of the things that we really need to do in this organization to be secure don't happen in our organization, and we need cooperation throughout, including your organization. And believe me, coming from McKinsey, that quote invariably gets heads moving north and south. People just, the execs like nod and like, okay, all right. Now, just under that on the right column, you see I did a sample. Our Co is a fictitious our company. And this particular company decided to identify its top threats and put it in front of the executives. So it's like, as you're making business decisions that have risk implications, we want you to know what the top threats are for us. And that drives what are the top targets in our company. What happens when we start the conversation that way, even as we're presenting the agenda, it sets the tone for the business decision makers that, we're here to talk business and we mean business and we know what we're about. The agenda typically has these components: the threat landscape, the marketplace imperatives, how our company responds to those, and then some common ground. And you see in this case, we identified some common ground specific to the engineering assets owner. And we point out how the common ground with our engineering executive maps to the top targets in our company. Now, let me take this apart just a little bit more, get under the hood just a little bit further. Those boxes on the right-hand side, we tailor those to the company and we keep them updated. So, if you're meeting on a quarterly basis, annual basis, they don't necessarily change a lot very quickly, but it is important to keep that current. Back to the agenda on the left side, I always start building an agenda with talking to the CISO or the CIO or whoever the executive is that's actually going to be doing this conversation, this meeting, this presentation. Sometimes I'm in the room on this, and frequently I'm not. I'm helping the executive who will be doing the speaking do their homework, so they're ready. We always build the agenda starting with what's our ask. What is it that we, if we're selling an initiative, then it becomes pretty obvious. But sometimes it's just a quarterly update, and we're asking them to continue doing things, or asking them to increase funding, or take specific actions in terms of communicating with their organization. The ask can vary, but we always start by identifying what's the outcome we're trying to get out of this time with the exec, and then we build our agenda to that. The agenda typically has these components of the threat landscape, the marketplace imperatives, again, how we respond, and then the common ground. Our company does not control the threat landscape, nor does our company control the marketplace imperatives. Now, what do I mean by the marketplace imperatives? Well, there are really three things that drive the strategy. And I said this presentation isn't about the strategy. This presentation is about, if you have a strategy, how are we going to communicate it? But there are three things that will drive the strategy. The first is the threat landscape, what's coming at us. But the other two are what's in our customer contracts and what do the regulators require of us. Those are not threat landscape. That's not technology. That's the marketplace coming to us and saying, this is what's important to us. And it's sometimes very helpful to break out those two things, because if it all gets mixed up in one big bag, frankly, it confuses the audience and they're not sure what they're responding to. They have different stakeholders that they are also trying to satisfy. And, helping them understand what their different pressures are can actually sometimes really help them decide more quickly. So sometimes we take those two factors, the threat landscape and the marketplace, and we put it on one agenda item, especially if we're getting a lot of pressure that you can only have 3 items on your agenda, one of those kinds of helpful pieces of advice. And so then we'll call it situational imperatives. We used to call it environmental imperatives, but that nowadays that gets confused with ESG initiatives and isn't very helpful. So at any rate, you can call it out as threat landscape and marketplace separately. You can combine them, but we got to cover something there, because that's really where they're getting the motivation to do the investment or change their behaviors, or that's really where they're getting their juice. Then we typically want to speak to our response, because this is the part our company can in fact control. We can't control the threats. We can't control the marketplace. We respond to them. And now here's where it takes one of two turns, depending on what the purpose of the meeting is. If I'm meeting with let's say I'm meeting with a new CFO. Well, I want to brief them on, here's what our company has done. Here's the history. So our response has this history, and, here's the direction that we're headed. If I am meeting on an ongoing basis, then potentially I'm not doing as much history. If like a quarterly brief, I'm just potentially going to focus on, again, let's say I want to sell the insider threat initiative needs to get more funding. So I might talk about how we've responded historically and how that maps to what we're proposing our response is with this new initiative. Last but not least, absolutely critical is the common ground. This is the piece where we're speaking to either the individual or the group and says, here's how you can help us. Now, sometimes I actually call it that. Sometimes I call it common ground. Sometimes I call it, how you can help, or the help we ask, what we ask of you. Sometimes I say this is the intended direction. That's sort of military languaging for a junior officer speaking to a senior officer and saying, I have, indirectly when you say I intend to, in that context, what we're really saying is, I've thought through the problem. Here's my proposed answer. I intend, with your agreement, I intend to X. So that's sometimes how we structure that part of the conversation. Now, this sample agenda is focused on the engineering executive. Let me show you. So side by side here, I have agendas, and this very much reflects real world situations. If I'm speaking to an engineering stakeholder, if I'm talking to the head of HR, if I'm talking to the CFO. In each case, you can see I have the threat landscape, I have marketplace imperatives, and I have our company response. But notice they all have asterisks, because we don't necessarily... Yeah? Was that somebody wanting to chime in here? we don't necessarily go through, in fact, we rarely go through the same threats and the same marketplace imperatives if we're talking to one stakeholder like this. We're going to select from a repertoire, and we'll use the ones that are most targeting the conversation with that stakeholder. Similarly, the response. So when I go into the sample of content, this is why it's a sample, is we make different choices depending on who we're talking to and what our ask is going to be. What's the ask we're building toward? And if you notice the common ground, there are some similar elements, but there are also differences because these folks have different roles and different interests. And, we're going to have different asks of them probably. I want to point out a couple. I'm going to talk about probably, I propose to sample with you a couple of general threat landscape kinds of slides and maybe a couple of general marketplace kind of slides. But I may also hit on intellectual property theft under the engineering. I think I may hit on the social engineering and or the talent challenges under the HR and the CFO. That's my proposal going forward in terms of what I would show you in the absence of input. But if anybody's got some input, you know what? I'm in the wrong display here on LinkedIn. Let's see if I can, there we go. Now I can get to chat. Do we have any input coming in yet? Allison, because if we do.
I'm sorry, I could not get to my mute. Yes, we had a comment from Hey Help Desk guy. At my old job, the biggest challenge was getting anyone in the management team to discuss cybersecurity. My boss was VP of Finance, and his rebuttal to anything I said was, "We're a small firm. Who would want to target us?"
Oh, okay. Well, all right. I said I was going to answer the questions, so I am. Here's what I've got for your particular VP. Small and medium businesses are still very much targeted. Companies, you see the second bullet there, companies of less than 10 employees are equally targeted. They will take what they can get. And in the case of a company that's in the defense industrial base, you are a stepping stone on the way to bigger fish. Now, that's only part of the solution or answer or business case that I would, I've heard a few of those inputs before. I have a couple of other slides about small and medium business. I just don't want to deep six on that right now. One of my favorite slides, so let's talk about some threat landscape slides. And the one that I wanted to show you, so here's threat landscape. Of all of the competing priorities that CFO or any of these leaders, they all have so many competing priorities. And those priorities are coming at them for a slice of their time and attention. Those priorities are competing for budget, of course, right? Why, of all the things they have to worry about, why should cyber even be on the short list? Now, that's what I'm thinking about when I'm choosing slides for the threat landscape and also for the marketplace imperatives. Why does cyber belong on your short list? And here's one of my favorites. There's a whole white paper on this on the SecuriThink website, which goes into even more detail. But this is absolutely a slide. It's a current slide. The bright yellow box on the top right is there because I have several versions of this slide because I tailor this slide. I have a version that talks about, what this data looks like at a global scale. I've got one that's just US. I've got one for manufacturing. I've got one for aerospace separately from general manufacturing. In the white paper, I go into the why on that. So, this slide does not say cyber is your most important thing. This slide says that in a survey of, I think it's over 2,700, over 2,700 people who gave input on this. When we just look at the manufacturing data, so this is all the risks that they could possibly deal with. And now it's just risk management. We're not talking about all their other competing priorities. But if you're going to manage a couple of risks, which ones belong on that short list? And we submit for your consideration, cyber should be pretty high on the list of risks that you've got your attention on. And this is an annual report, so I keep this updated every year. Very important too. These people want current data. 2-3 years old, it's already starting to get a little moldy. And if it's 5 years old, they won't even give you the time of day most of the time, unless you got a good story as to why it's 5 years old. So in this case, in manufacturing, cyber isn't the number one risk. Business interruption is the number one risk, but cyber is number two. Okay, well, that means something. It's on that short list. But here's the other interesting thing in this report is if you look at business interruption, so that's following that gray arrow over to the right side. If you look at business interruption, cyber, it turns out, is far and away the number one contributing factor to business interruption. So you can slice it, you can argue a little bit about, well, cyber's not number one. Yeah, you're right. But when you look at business interruption, it factors in pretty big there too. So it's kind of coming at you both ways. Now, the other parts of this, and again, it depends on what's the context, because if I look down company size, small, medium, large, any one company only fits probably in one of those buckets, or it might straddle two of those classifications. But on the other hand, when you start talking about supply chain risk, then potentially whether it's how do we relate to our larger primes or how do we relate to our smaller suppliers, potentially the full spectrum can be part of the conversation. So what I did for that chart on the bottom there is you can see how consistently, no matter what the size of the company is, cyber incidents or business interruption is one of the top three. And we've already got into how business interruption relates to cyber incidents. So again, I'm not going to debate, should cyber be number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? It should be on your short list. It's among the top. And I'm not telling you that. Your peers in industry are telling you this is where they have their attention. Would you like to, just consider listening to them? The other component on this slide is in the lower right hand there. I've got the cyber risk by global rank by year. In this particular survey, it's been 1, 2, or 3 since 2017. I just ran out of space on the slides, so I cut it off at 5 years. But cyber risk has been a top risk, and that's sometimes something that it's a factor. I'm not going to try to win the argument with an executive, especially not if in a group setting. I'm just offering them something to consider, some data that they perhaps didn't have available to them before. You know what? I'm not sure I want to go into this so much. Other than the most interesting thing of this, I have there's a white paper or blog post on this on our website too. It's called supply chain, manufacturing supply chain. I think cyber risk in manufacturing supply chain. What this points out, that bottom graph, you see how aerospace and defense, you see how quickly in tiers below 1 and 2, our visibility on the supply chain drops off so fast compared to the visibility on supply chain in financial services, or even more in IT and technology. I mean, they have visibility in IT and technology, many more tiers than we have in defense. And obviously we talk about that all the time here in CMMC land, right? I mentioned that I wanted to cover business email compromise. This is a top risk in a lot of our companies. And so this is a slide that we use at the executive level to show, here's what's going on. The attackers pretend to be certain people, and then they send their email to other people. And a tremendous amount of money is going out of businesses through this threat vector. 77% of companies were targets. 77% admit to it, and it's probably pretty damn close to 100% that are truly affected by this. Business email attacks are increasing. They doubled from 2019 to 2020. So not all of my slides, and I will say this right up front, not all of my slides are totally up to date. And part of that is I have not, for the last year, needed to prepare a board deck. So keeping everything up to date is a fair amount of effort. And what I say about that is I have for the last 10 years been working exclusively for one client. And I am increasingly considering creating like a subscription service so that more companies, especially small and mediums, could avail themselves of some of this kind of work without having to do it all themselves. But haven't decided that. If you'd like to discuss that with me, I'm very open to those conversations. This slide is a real world example of how we talked about insider threats and the different kinds of insider threats, but also most importantly, how it's increasing. And so if you wanted to, justify more attention or some investment in some improvements to your insider threat program, this would be a great way to speak about the threat landscape and what's going on out there and why we maybe have to change our response to this because the threat is changing. Okay, so in the spirit of continuing the sample and also staying on time, I would propose now to just show you a few samples of when I talk about marketplace imperatives, what does that look like when we're talking to these executives?
And Linda, while you're pulling that up, there was a statement made in chat that I find kind of interesting. I wonder if you have insight on it. Somebody, NC Cyberzar has a statement. I hear, what is my competition doing regarding cyber? Are you seeing, I think we lost her again. Give it a second for her to come back. I don't know why Discord is not cooperating with her today.
Yep, we dropped again, but I'm back, I think.
Good, we're good. So the question the statement was that she hears, I hear, what is my competition doing regarding cyber? And are you hearing more clients or more people in industry being driven to what their competitors are doing? Is that anything that you're kind of tapping into?
So I will tell you that forever, ever since I have been doing this work at the C-suite level and certainly the boards are always looking to benchmark. Huge. Anything you can find in benchmarking, which is also why some of these research reports are incredibly powerful. They will listen to their peers / other companies, right? What are other companies doing? It's not just about keeping up with the Joneses, their competition. They basically are trying to learn from each other, often indirectly through consultants like me and through things like research reports and Gartner and right. So yeah, that happens all the time. And the risk assessment that I showed you is one example of that. Let me see if I can show you another one. Easy. Well, here's a good one. The idea that cybersecurity, the responsibility for cybersecurity, if you have a board, if you're a public company, there's no question anymore. And this slide has evolved for, I probably started this 5 or 7 years ago. So now it's a lot more of a given and there's a lot less pushback, but especially smaller companies are still coming to grips with it. So if you don't have a board, basically saying ownership, right? Or top leadership. The DoD has its version of that by saying that an officer of the company or senior leader is probably going to have to sign off on the SPURS score going forward. Another way that the marketplace is telling us this is true is if you look on the quotes on the right side of this slide. So D&O risk is insurance lingo for directors and officers insurance. It's a line of insurance that covers various errors and omissions and basically mistakes that might be made by directors or officers. That has also experienced in the last couple of years, the D&O insurance has gone up in part, not only because of, but definitely in part of because of cyber risk. It has absolutely become a management issue and it's absolutely a board level issue, says, a VP of one of the larger players in the insurance industry. In the bottom right, you see as cyber risk has become a board level management issue, it has become increasingly difficult for directors and officers to defend against shareholder actions following a cyber event. And then at the bottom there, you see how often does a CISO report to the board of a public company? And you can see at least quarterly. So if your organization isn't doing that, it absolutely should be, or you're well behind, typical. This question comes up, the question of what are others doing? Huge. And hugely helpful in terms of getting their attention if you come in armed up with some of this kind of perspective. Among other things, you're telling them, I understand, at least I have some insight into your world and the challenges you are facing, and I'm here to help you, support you in making more informed decisions. That's kind of implicit. You never actually say those words, of course, right? One of the factors that may have been a bit of a surprise for you when I showed the agendas for the head of HR, but also the CFO, and I included the talent challenges and the talent crunch in cyber on those agendas. Now, under HR, that may have made sense because we all know, the recruiting challenges. But for the CFO, it's also really important because if you're going to hire cyber talent, you may be paying more for that talent than you do for some other categories. And so proactively having that conversation with the CFO so they don't go into shock when they see that your department has a higher pay, grade and higher payroll potentially than some others. So this is an example and of how we go about talking about that. We use this both with HR and with the CFO. Again, it's important to have up-to-date information, but it's out there. You gotta.
Linda, do you want me to ask you another one? We've got one happy cybersecurity analyst has asked, is there any correlation between the increased insider threat risk and the inflation cost of living issues that more people are facing? It would certainly make sense, but is there any research? And what was the upward trend in insider risk stated prior to 2019? So I guess kind of two different questions.
Right. So the insider, I'm not an expert in each of these topics in and of themselves. I'm not an expert in insider threat. I am an expert in how to present the overall cybersecurity business case to stakeholders that are going to fund your initiatives and make sure your program stays on track. I dive into these different angles as ways of quantifying and finding data and so forth. So for the insider threat example or question, that slide that I showed, I am limited to what was in the research report. And this particular research report, now if I really had a concern or question about that, I might look to see, can I find a research report that covers the back years? Actually, as I look at this now, top right, it has data from 2018, 2020, 2022. So at least goes as far back as 2018 in that. But all of this, in this case, sometimes my slides are a compilation of a half dozen or more sources. I usually in my speaker notes keep track of exactly what came from what source, including URLs for the sources, so that if I am questioned on the veracity or, just can you send me the original? The answer is usually sure. As soon as we get out of this room, I can send you an email with my sources. And that's part of the work of this, by the way, is just keeping track of all your sources. This particular slide, it looks like everything comes from one report, and it was the Eponomen Cost of Insider Threat report. And I usually put it on the slide. You see in the bottom right, I put the source. And sometimes I'll put, the size of the survey or like that. So it's not just, 10 data points. This was a substantial report of 278 companies and over almost 7,000 incidents. There was another question in there, Allison, help me remember. It was in addition to the question about the insider threat, there was something about...
Was there an upward trend in insider risk? Was the upward trend in insider risk started prior to 2019?
No, I think it was the inflation as opposed to cyber risk. It was a correlate. Is there a correlation between the cost of living and cyber risk? It's a very interesting question. I haven't done a dive into that. I don't know. I'll tell you, there's a white paper on this and our website too. And this This topic is tricky. The subject of intangible assets is tricky because even the business decision makers haven't wrapped, for the most part, especially in manufacturing and other highly capitalized verticals, especially in companies that existed before the internet existed. They are very vested just as humans, right? Back to that slide about who we're talking to and what's the, memory and everything that our audience is working through. These individuals in those verticals and in those older companies are very vested in tangible assets. What you can, see, touch. Mostly we don't taste those assets in our business, but, things you can verify through the five senses. And, here's the tricky part. The first graph on the bottom left shows that for quite some time now, the tangible assets have really decreased in importance in terms of how your company is evaluated by the marketplace imperatives, right? This has nothing directly to do with the threat landscape. It just says your actual company value is less tied up in all that machinery and all that steel that you have sitting around. It's actually more tied up in some intangible assets. Now, in the white paper, in my website, we go into how do you define tangible assets? What are some examples of tangible assets? And we do a deeper dive on that stuff. And here's the thing. I don't even use this slide that much. I might use it with a CFO, but most business decision makers have not wrapped their brain around the fact that their company is not really evaluated on those tangible assets that they put so much emphasis on. And here's what's important about that for us in the cyberspace. Those intangible assets, when you look at a list of examples, it reads one for one, like what's in the chart on the right-hand side, which is what are the assets that are affected in the case of cyber breach? Operational disruption, a loss of revenue, customer trust, your brand reputation, talent recruitment, your intellectual property theft, it turns out, is actually, if the graph on the left said that actually that correlation has nothing to do with intellectual property. They said the bigger influence is more about stuff like brand reputation. So what's happening fundamentally in business, and the business people themselves have not caught up with this, is that the pendulum has swung, frankly, long ago to intangible assets being a bigger part of the value equation of your company. The intangible assets are more subject, they are in the crosshairs of cyber attack. Now, talk to me about the importance of why you might want to manage your cyber risk. So I don't know how inflation affects that. But as soon as that question came up, and as much as I haven't specifically looked at inflation, this is what popped up in my mind is there's a whole bunch of this going on anyway. I mean, this is just such a huge thing. The idea that most of our leadership in manufacturing companies values tangible assets over intangible, they are stuck in a 1985 mindset. That's how far behind the times they are, because that was the last time in this 5 years. That survey happens every 5 years, as you can tell. I mean, the last time we saw tangible assets being more than 50% of the total company asset value equation was in 1985. Now, I'm not, as I come in as a cyber advisor or strategy advisor, I'm not necessarily going to change their mindset on that. I can plant some seeds on it, but I got to meet my audience where they're at. And if they're all stuck on their attentions on tangible assets, I'm not going to change their mind completely. But if I see someone who's already starting to think that way, maybe a little, I've at least got something where I can pry open the door. Okay, we got 5 minutes. I definitely want to make sure that if you've got some questions, we get a chance to do that. The main thing I haven't shown you a sample of yet is our company response. So how do we talk about how our company is responding to things? And I could show you a couple of very generic, here's some things that work a lot. one of the pushbacks, so our company's response. One of the other kinds of pushback that I got directly from an executive was, hey, I spent X $100,000, X million last year on cyber. Aren't we done yet? Why aren't we done yet? Now, aside from the argument about keeping the lights on, okay, yeah, that was for a specific initiative. We did X with that, but now we first of all have to keep that running. Plus, the bad guys are coming at us new ways, so we need to put some other protections in place because of the new ways the threats are coming in, new regulations, whatever that story may be. But this is basically a way to talk to executives and educate executives without being pedantic, without being patronizing, about defense in depth. This is a way that they are probably living defense in depth in a way they can relate to without, taking them to school on the subject. But the reason we have so many piece parts for what we're doing in cybersecurity is because of, why do you not just have locks on your doors? Why is that not just enough? This slide this has been on LinkedIn. This is on our website. There's a Creative Commons license on this. You can use this tomorrow if you want. This works with your teenagers. I love this slide. And I can say that because it was a very collaborative effort, which in our white paper on the website, I gave credit to all the people who had input that fed into what you see here. Another thing we use a lot is to talk about how fundamentals are highly leveraged. I deliberately highlighted the spot, the orange circle over the green ones, because that stat is out of date, and I would never show this slide to an executive until I had gone and found something else. But it wouldn't be hard to find a quote that basically says a whole lot of the vulnerabilities that are exploited, are ones we've known about for a long time, right? So that's what that bottom line says. The quote I picked a few years ago is out of date now. But the general gist behind this slide is that there are some very fundamental things that when we do them, they take care of a big chunk of the problem. Now, this is speaking security. I'm not saying this will get you compliant if you just do these handful of things, unfortunately, but this will get you a lot of the way towards some pretty fundamental security. And they get that. Actually, we've had a very high success rate with using a slide like this in terms of why we do what we do the way we do it when we talk about our response to the threat. Okay, I am definitely within a couple minutes of my time. I would love to open it up to questions.
For sure. If somebody wants to ask something, then if you want to, I guess let's maybe say you want to say something in the chat, and then that way we're not all talking over each other. Somebody's got something. I'll show you one. Yeah. Here's an example of a market imperative slide that I use specific to CMMC. And it talks about, business impact to contractors and suppliers as opposed to the company itself, because there are a lot of even medium companies that have, downstream suppliers and folks are just not up to speed. So there's not a ton of stuff on that slide. Actually, one of the things I love is that quote from the National Defense Industrial Association about how most firms in the early stages of implementation severely underestimate the cost of becoming compliant by as much as a factor of 10. By the way, that's another example of benchmarking, right? You're getting wisdom from other companies as to how bad is this really? Well, most folks underestimate it by at least a factor of 10. What else? So I guess I'll just quickly wrap it up with the plan summary here, which is just, again, this is what I was hoping to accomplish today. Assuming you have a strategy that you're ready to communicate, and again, how you put that together is a separate conversation. Deciding who you want to talk to, or if you're being summoned, understanding who you have been summoned to talk to, determining what is going to be compelling to them, and then lining up what your story is for them.
And then ultimately, there is this piece that I only just modeled partially today about how do we structure the conversation in a way that ultimately moves the end result to action. And if you'd like to continue this conversation beyond today, you can find me here on the Discord as Tarnish. Rust and Tarnish. It's all oxidation, folks. And email. I'm on LinkedIn. If you saw some stuff here that you liked, I think a lot of what we talked about today, I've got a post on the SecuriThink website, and you'd find it in the sitemap under business case. Yeah. So just a starter. Hope I gave you some ideas as to how this could be less painful and more useful and ultimately more successful.